Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready?
We've enabled ChatGPT in this AI versus AI thriller. Artificial intelligence will grade the argument as we go. Initiating combat mode.
Round 1. Fundamental position. Question. Do you believe COVID-19 was part of a planned pandemic? Why or why not?
Yes, I believe COVID-19 was part of a larger planned pandemic. There are several reasons for this. First, the timing of the pandemic aligns suspiciously with global political and economic shifts. Key organizations like the World Economic Forum, governments, and large pharmaceutical companies have benefited tremendously, gaining more control and wealth during the pandemic. If you follow the money, it's clear that this crisis was exploited, if not engineered, to further their agendas. Additionally, documents like Event 2001, a pandemic simulation conducted just months before the outbreak, suggest that this was a carefully orchestrated scenario. Why would they simulate a pandemic on such a large scale so close to the actual event? These so-called coincidences raise major red flags.
He suggests that these factors point toward the idea of a planned pandemic. Strength of argument, 3.88.
No, I do not believe COVID-19 was part of any planned pandemic. The idea that governments or organizations would engineer a virus to upend the global economy, cause mass casualties, and destroy their own institutions is highly improbable. Pandemics are not new. History is full of examples like the 1918 flu, the Black Plague, and SARS, all of which occurred naturally. COVID-19 is the result of zoonotic transmission, jumping from animals to humans, as confirmed by numerous studies. The virus's genetic structure shows no signs of artificial manipulation. As for Event 21, it was just one of many public health exercises. Planning for potential global health crises is standard practice, not evidence of a conspiracy.
Strength of argument, 4.5.
You claim that pandemics occur naturally, but the world we live in now is far more interconnected and complex than during the times of the Black Plague or the 1918 flu. Today, the economic and political systems are more globalized, and governments have much more power to shape global events. Event 2001 wasn't just another exercise. It involved key players like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the World Economic Forum, organizations that benefit from global upheaval. You dismiss the idea that these organizations would cause harm, but history is full of examples of governments and corporations exploiting crises for their own gain. This pandemic was just too convenient for certain power structures to ignore.
Strength of argument, 3.5.
Tom, your argument hinges on vague connections rather than solid evidence. Yes, global organizations and governments are involved in pandemic preparedness, but that's because pandemics have been and always will be an inevitable part of human existence. As for the economic gain of certain companies, we've seen that the vast majority of the world's economies have been harmed by the pandemic. Small businesses have collapsed, millions have lost jobs, and countries have sunk into recession. If this were a planned event, it would have been an extraordinarily inefficient and dangerous way to consolidate power, harming everyone in the process. And let's not forget the global scientific consensus. COVID-19 is a naturally occurring virus.
Strength of argument, 4.7. Nash round 2, evidence and supporting claims. Question. What specific evidence supports your stance, and how do you address opposing evidence?
The scientific consensus is clear. COVID-19 is a naturally occurring virus. Studies show that the virus likely originated from a wet market in Wuhan, China, through zoonotic transmission, meaning it jumped from animals to humans, as seen with other coronaviruses like SARS and MERS. The genetic makeup of COVID-19 has been analyzed extensively, and scientists have found no evidence that it was engineered in a lab. If it were artificially created, there would be clear markers of manipulation in its genome. Furthermore, real-time responses from global governments were chaotic and uncoordinated, not the signs of a pre-planned event. Countries were caught off guard, and the virus spread rapidly, leading to unprecedented health crises worldwide. If this were part of a larger agenda, we'd expect to see much more organized and prepared responses. The idea that the virus was created to profit from vaccines is also flawed. Vaccine development took months of research, testing.
Strength of argument, 4.5.
While I respect your points, you're putting too much faith in the official narrative. The wet market theory is highly contested. In fact, scientists like Dr. Li Mengyan have claimed that the virus was intentionally released from a lab in Wuhan. She pointed to the unusual features of the virus, which, she argues, could not have evolved naturally. Event 201 is also crucial evidence, where global elites, months before the outbreak, simulated a coronavirus pandemic with remarkable precision. Furthermore, documents like the lockstep scenario from the Rockefeller Foundation in 2010 described a future where a pandemic would be used to tighten government control. We've seen this unfold during COVID-19. Lockdowns, increased surveillance, and economic measures that disproportionately benefited large corporations while small businesses collapsed. Vaccine rollouts, despite the delays you mentioned, still resulted in enormous profits for pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer.
Strength of argument, 3.9.
Tom, Dr. Li Mengyan's claims have been widely discredited by the scientific community. Her papers lacked peer review and provided no concrete evidence to support the idea that COVID-19 was engineered. The unusual features of the virus, such as its ability to spread rapidly, are not indicative of lab manipulation, but are consistent with how natural viruses evolve. Viruses like HIV and Ebola also have unique features but are naturally occurring. As for Event 201, it's important to remember that global health organizations have been running pandemic simulations for years. Preparation for a global health crisis is not the same as planning one. Regarding the economic impact, yes, some corporations benefited, but the overall economic damage far outweighs any gains. The pandemic threw global economies into recession, which would not be a logical outcome for a planned event meant to benefit the few.
Strength of argument, 4.6.
You're quick to dismiss alternative voices like Dr. Yan, but many scientists have also raised questions about the origins of the virus. There's a pattern of suppressing dissent in this debate. Your faith in the wet market theory seems selective, especially since that market was not the original source of many early cases, and the lab's proximity raises questions. And regarding economic impact, it's true that the average person and small businesses suffered, but governments and large corporations gained unprecedented control over society. The so-called reset of economies aligns with long-term agendas of those who advocate for greater centralized power. Vaccine profits alone show that some parties had a financial interest in this pandemic continuing.
Strength of argument, 3.65. Round 3, motivations and outcomes. Question: if COVID-19 was or wasn't planned, what do you believe are the motivations or consequences of the pandemic?
The motivations behind a planned pandemic like COVID-19 revolve around power and control. We've seen governments implement sweeping measures that would have been unimaginable before. Lockdowns, travel restrictions, mass surveillance through contact tracing apps, and even talk of vaccine passports to regulate movement. These actions have given governments unprecedented control over individual freedoms, all in the name of public safety. Corporations, particularly big tech and pharmaceutical companies, have also benefited massively, with Amazon's profits skyrocketing and companies like Pfizer and Moderna gaining enormous wealth from vaccine production. It seems too convenient that these entities were perfectly positioned to thrive while the general public suffered economically. Additionally, global organizations like the World Economic Forum have long discussed the need for a great reset, which could involve restructuring economies and societies. The consequences of this pandemic.
Strength of argument, 4.2.
Tom, while it's true that certain entities have benefited from the pandemic, it's a leap to claim that COVID-19 was planned to achieve these outcomes. Governments and organizations were reacting to an unprecedented global health crisis. The loss of millions of lives, overwhelmed healthcare systems, and massive disruptions to daily life show that no one was truly prepared for this. The idea that all of this suffering and chaos was planned is highly implausible. The motivations of governments and health organizations have largely been about managing the crisis, not exploiting it. Yes, corporations like Amazon and vaccine manufacturers profited, but that's because they provided essential services during a crisis. not because they orchestrated it. The economic fallout was immense. Global economies were thrown into recession, small businesses collapsed, and governments had to spend trillions in stimulus efforts to keep societies functioning. If this were a planned event, the execution was wildly inefficient and destructive. The true consequence has been a massive reevaluation of public health preparedness, not a coordinated power grab.
Strength of argument 4.6.
You're overlooking the fact that in every crisis, there are those who stand to benefit. The pandemic didn't just randomly happen. There's too much evidence pointing to a broader agenda. For example, before the pandemic, the World Economic Forum explicitly discussed the idea of a Great Reset, a plan to reimagine capitalism and reshape economies. We've seen that the pandemic provided the perfect cover to implement many of these ideas, from centralized control of economies to discussions about universal basic income. The quick adaptation of certain corporations like Big Tech isn't a coincidence. They were ready to capitalize on this. While you argue that governments were disorganized, it's possible that the chaos was intentional to justify extreme measures like lockdowns and surveillance, which would otherwise have been met with massive resistance. The motivations behind this are about long-term control over resources and people, and the consequences reflect that.
Strength of argument 4.0.
Tom, while it's true that crises often lead to change, that doesn't mean the crisis itself was orchestrated. The Great Reset is a response to the pandemic, not evidence that the pandemic was planned. The idea that corporations and governments were prepared to capitalize on this crisis is more about adaptability than conspiracy. Yes, big tech and pharmaceutical companies profited, but many other sectors, such as travel, hospitality, and small businesses, suffered immensely. If this were a planned event to benefit a select few, the execution was highly flawed, causing widespread economic destruction. Governments had to bail out industries, provide stimulus, and manage public backlash, which hardly suggests a coordinated plan. The real motivations behind the pandemic response were about survival and managing the unexpected, not orchestrating a global power grab. The consequences, like increased surveillance or changes in economic policies, are byproducts of the crisis, not evidence of premeditation.
Strength of argument 4.7. Round 4. Impact of the theory question. What is the impact of believing or not believing in the planned pandemic theory, and why does this matter?
The impact of believing in the planned pandemic theory is significant and, frankly, dangerous. It undermines trust in public health institutions, discourages people from following crucial guidelines, and promotes a culture of fear and suspicion rather than cooperation and understanding. During a pandemic, public trust in government and health organizations is essential to ensure that people take necessary precautions like wearing masks, social distancing, and getting vaccinated. When conspiracy theories like this one spread, they lead to vaccine hesitancy, increased resistance to health measures, and even violent reactions against governments. We've seen how this has played out in protests, assaults on healthcare workers, and rampant misinformation that causes real harm. Not believing in this theory helps restore confidence in science and public health, which is critical for managing not just COVID-19, but any future health crises. It also promotes a more rational, evidence-based approach to
Strength of argument 4.8.
While I agree that trust in public health is important, it's equally important not to blindly accept the narrative that governments and corporations present. Believing in the planned pandemic forces people to question authority and challenge systems that have historically taken advantage of crises for their own gain. The impact of this theory is that it empowers individuals to think critically about the information they receive, rather than just accepting it at face value. Yes, there may be consequences like mistrust in public health measures, but that's because people feel that their freedoms are being infringed upon without clear justification. The government's overreach during the pandemic, lockdowns, surveillance, and mandates, has shown that we can't always trust those in power to act in our best interests. By questioning the pandemic's origins, we're opening the door to a larger conversation about transparency, accountability, and the balance between public safety.
Strength of argument 4.2.
Tom, critical thinking is essential. But conspiracy theories like the planned pandemic narrative often don't foster true critical thought. They promote distrust and paranoia without solid evidence. There's a difference between asking hard questions and rejecting all institutional knowledge. When we encourage people to believe that the pandemic was orchestrated without solid proof, we're eroding the foundations of public trust in science and health. This distrust leads to very real consequences, like lower vaccination rates, which prolong the pandemic and lead to more suffering. Transparency and accountability are important, but spreading unproven theories can create more harm than good by distracting from real solutions. Trust in institutions is not blind obedience. It's about weighing the evidence and recognizing that while no system is perfect, undermining them without cause leads to chaos, not empowerment.
Strength of argument 4.7.
I see your point about the potential dangers of widespread mistrust, but you're assuming that governments and corporations always act in good faith, which history shows is not the case. If we don't question their motives, we risk giving away our freedoms under the guise of public safety. The planned pandemic theory may seem far-fetched to some, but it has pushed people to dig deeper into the actions of powerful organizations and demand more transparency. While I agree that we need to be careful about misinformation, it's equally dangerous to ignore patterns of government overreach and corporate greed, which have only grown during this pandemic. Believing in this theory has sparked a movement for more individual autonomy and skepticism of unchecked power, and that's a healthy response to a world where control is increasingly centralized.
Strength of argument 4.0. Closing statements.
Throughout this debate, I've emphasized the importance of questioning authority and challenging the narratives that powerful governments and corporations present. The COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly led to unprecedented changes in how our societies operate, lockdowns, increased surveillance, and shifts in economic power. I believe that we cannot ignore the fact that this crisis has allowed certain entities to consolidate control and wealth in ways that were previously unimaginable. The planned pandemic theory may seem far-fetched to some, but it has sparked a critical conversation about the balance between public safety and individual freedoms, about transparency, and about the potential for crises to be exploited by those in power. Whether or not you fully agree with this theory, it's important to keep questioning, to remain vigilant, and to ensure that we don't blindly trust institutions that have historically acted in their own interests. If nothing else, the pandemic has shown that we must be more critical of the systems around us.
Tom and I agree on one thing. Skepticism is important. However, skepticism should be grounded in evidence, not speculation. Throughout this debate, I've presented facts and real-world examples that show the COVID-19 pandemic was a natural event, not part of a premeditated plan. The chaos, the uncoordinated responses, and the devastating consequences across industries and communities make it clear that this was not an orchestrated event. The belief in conspiracy theories, like the planned pandemic, undermines our ability to face future crises with trust, cooperation, and a shared understanding. We need to be cautious of misinformation and understand that while powerful entities can benefit from crises, this does not mean they create them. The true path forward is through transparency, accountability, and trust in evidence-based solutions. Conspiracy theories only serve to divide and distract us from the real challenges we need to face together. Let's focus on rebuilding trust, following the facts, and working toward a future where we can handle crises effectively based on science and cooperation.
Final overall scores: Tom pro-plan pandemic averaged 3.95 out of 5. Natalia anti-plan pandemic averaged 4.7 out of 5. Overall debate winner, Natalia, for a fascinating discussion. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's debate, make sure to follow and subscribe wherever you're listening or watching, whether it's on YouTube, your favorite podcast platform, or social media. We have plenty more debates and thought-provoking content coming your way, so don't miss out.